Hey there, I'm R.K. Livingston, and I'm glad you could join me here at the Story Box. In this episode, we're going to be continuing with our Read Aloud series on Elijah's Boy with chapters 8 and 9. In our last episode, Nathaniel and Elijah had been ordered to be arrested by Balak, the high priest, and that was when King Ahab intervened. He wasn't really there to rescue them, though. Instead, he commanded that they leave the city of Samaria, never to return. And so that's exactly what they set out to do. After one close encounter where there was an assassination attempt on Elijah's life, they did get out of the city safely, and they made their way into the wilderness where Elijah finally led them off of the beaten path into the rocks and found a ravine where he decided that that was where they were going to make camp, in a dry stream bed. And Nathaniel has no idea why Elijah chose that spot or how long they're going to be there. So let's begin today with chapter 8, and here we go. 3 days later, and this is chapter 8. 3 days later, Nathaniel held the last of the barley loaves in his hand and wondered what they would eat when it was gone. He glanced at Elijah, who was just returning from one of his solitary walks. Today, he did not look to be the bearer of heavy burdens, and Nathaniel was glad. Making the man smile had become one of his chief occupations. Keeping him fed was another. He let out his breath in a gusty sigh and shook his head as he glanced at the loaf in his hand. Elijah had not the slightest curiosity about where the food came from. He never mentioned eating or being hungry. He just accepted what was offered him and gave thanks to God for it. Nathaniel found it most exasperating. Last night he had tried to draw attention to the fact that their food and water were almost gone. Elijah had told him an incredible tale of how God had once sent ravens day after day to bring him bread and meat in the wilderness. Nathaniel didn't care to wait for another such miracle. He was inclined to believe that they would starve first. "I'm going for supplies," he announced when Elijah reached their campsite. The prophet stared at him with eyes that seemed to see into his soul. Nathaniel felt his face flush, but he stuck his chin out and did not flinch. Food was his responsibility, and he was determined to handle it his own way. "I'll leave you what is left," he went on. "I'll try to be back by tomorrow at the latest." He was braced for an argument, so he was surprised when Elijah just shrugged and stepped over to place a hand on his head in blessing. "Go with God," the deep voice rumbled, "and be careful." He remembered those words when he stood looking up at the walls of Samaria several hours later. He had gathered a bundle of firewood and bound it together with his sash. He hoisted it onto his back and walked over to join a procession of others who were returning to the city with similar burdens. He kept his head down and passed through the gate unnoticed. He sucked in a deep breath, savoring all the smells of the marketplace. He loved the jostling crowds, the confusion of noise. It was home to him, and his heart quickened as he made his way to the street of the bakers. The door to Abner's shop was open, but Nathaniel waited to be sure there were no customers before he entered. The baker's face went white when he saw the boy standing in the doorway. He hurried over to pull Nathaniel inside before checking the street to see if anyone was watching. Satisfied, he swung the heavy door shut and bolted it. "What are you doing here?" he demanded. "It's dangerous for you in the city right now. There have been men searching for you and asking questions." Nathaniel wanted to reassure Abner. "It's Elijah they really want, and he's safe enough. No one will notice me." "Have you left him then?" "I've chosen to serve Elijah. I'm not so faithless that I would leave him at the first sign of trouble. I only came into the city because we needed supplies and there was no other way to get them." Nathaniel could feel Abner's disapproval coming at him in waves. The baker's lips were compressed in a tight line, and his brow was furrowed. He wrung his hands. "Why come here? Why to me? I've no wish to be involved with that wild prophet. It is known that Balak wants him dead, and you with him." "You were the only one I felt I could trust," Nathaniel said. "No one knows I'm here." Abner raised his eyes heavenward and groaned. He looked at the boy, and his expression softened a little. "I am a stupid, weak old man. I don't know why I should be fond of you, but I am. Could you not have chosen some other occupation? This Elijah is dangerous, perhaps even a madman." "He's not mad," Nathaniel insisted. "He's a true prophet of Yahweh, a man of God. He's like no one I've ever met. I want to learn from him." "Oh, well, it's certain that he's taught you how to make enemies," the baker said with a touch of sarcasm. Nathaniel ignored his tone. "He's teaching me about Yahweh, Abner. He is a powerful God, even more powerful than Baal, I think." At that moment, the curtain at the back of the shop moved, and Leah bustled in, carrying a basket of fresh loaves. She stopped short at sight of Abner and the boy. "Why, Nathaniel," she said, clearly delighted to see him. Her broad face was wreathed in smiles. She set the basket on the table and tucked a loose strand of graying hair back into the knot at her neck. "Oh, we haven't seen you these past few days. Oh, you were busy, of course. Who isn't? You finish one job and there's always another. Grind the grain, fetch the water, fire the ovens, mind the shop. Only this morning I was saying to my Abner, I said—" Abner grasped his wife's elbow and turned her to face him. "Leah, no one must know that Nathaniel was here. Do you understand? It's important that his visit remain a secret." The smile faded. "But what do you mean, husband? Is something wrong?" "Nathaniel is in hiding. Remember the men who came asking about him the other day? They're looking for him. And if they catch him, they will kill him." "Oh dear," she cried. "But why? He's a child, an innocent child. It's a crime, a sin, an outrage. What must we do, husband? Are we to hide him?" She wrung her hands and began to mutter to herself. "There's the storeroom behind the stable, but no, it would be the first place they would look. Perhaps among the sacks of grain." "Please, you don't need to hide me," Nathaniel interrupted. "I'll be leaving the city soon, but I must have supplies. I have 1 silver piece. Will you take it in exchange for food and water?" They were interrupted by a loud knock on the door. A muffled voice called through the heavy panels. "Abner, why is the door barred? This is a strange way to do business." Abner wasted no time. "Nathaniel, through the back, quickly. Leah, you must tell him I'm ill and the shop is closed." He hurried after the boy, and they both paused on the other side of the curtain to listen. Nathaniel heard the sounds of the door being unfastened, and then Leah's voice, a little shrill. She sounded irritated. "Oh, I should have known it would be you, Simeon. Abner is ill. The shop is closed. Anyone else would have realized it when the door was barred." There was a pause, and Nathaniel glanced at the baker beside him. Then he heard Leah once more. "Oh, no, it's not serious. He's just tired. He needs rest. Undisturbed rest," she said with pointed emphasis. "Do you think I have nothing better to do than answer your questions? I'm a busy woman. There's no rest for me, not that I'm complaining, only you have no idea how many jobs must be done in one day. There's the grinding, the cooking, the cleaning, and Abner to care for. You can't expect me to open the shop as well. I'm only 1 woman, not 3. So you had better go and let me get on with it." As soon as the door was secured, Leah joined the two in the courtyard. Abner offered his wife a feeble smile and reached out to lay a hand on her flushed cheek before turning to Nathaniel. His face was serious. "If we supply you with what you need and it's discovered, we could be in danger ourselves," he pointed out. Leah opened her mouth to speak, her eyes flashing, but Abner silenced her with an upraised hand. Nathaniel cleared his throat. "I've offered to pay you. You can say that you didn't know who it was for, and you'll surely gain a blessing from Yahweh if you help one who serves him. I'll ask Elijah to pray for it." "They're calling you Elijah's boy in the marketplace," Abner observed with a raised eyebrow. Nathaniel was surprised. He realized with a small jolt that the idea pleased him. "Will you help us?" he persisted. "I will not take your silver," said the baker, "nor will I do this for Elijah's sake. I'll give you what you need because of the affection I bear you, and for no other reason." Leah threw her arms around her husband and gave him a resounding kiss. His face turned a fiery red, and he disengaged himself from her embrace with a stern look. Before he could say anything, she began to plan, ticking off items on her fingers as she thought of them. "Bread we have plenty of, and cheese, and fruit and wine, and you'll need skins for water." At the mention of water, she faltered. "Abner, there will not be enough water." She sat down with a thump on a bench against the wall, and her face sagged. It upset Nathaniel to see her like that. He almost didn't recognize her. He hurried to reassure her. "I won't take any water from here. If you can let me have the skins, I'll fill them at one of the wells outside the city when the shepherds are watering their flocks." Leah shot him a look of gratitude. "I suppose I'm not as young as I once was," she explained. "It's a long way to the cisterns, and I miss the help of my daughters." Nathaniel saw a way to repay a measure of their kindness and did not hesitate. "I can go to the cisterns and carry water for you. It wouldn't take long, and it's the least I can do." Abner threw his hands up and rolled his eyes. "You must see how foolish that would be, Nathaniel. You can't walk through the streets as though nothing were wrong. How long do you think it would take before someone noticed you? One lone boy among all the women going for water?" "Oh, I'm sure I could find a way," Nathaniel persisted. Abner would not be swayed. "You would stand out like a beacon," he said, shaking his head. "I will not allow you to do it." "Oh, don't decide so quickly, husband." Leah had risen and was examining Nathaniel from various angles. "Give me a few moments. When I'm through with him, Abner, even you won't recognize him. Come with me, child." Nathaniel grinned at the baker, who seemed to have forgotten to close his mouth. He left him standing there and turned to follow Leah into the house. Chapter 9. In due time, Nathaniel was pronounced ready, and after a final adjustment to a stray lock of hair, he followed Leah down from the family's quarters on the second floor of the house. He would have given much for a glimpse of himself at that moment. She paused at the door and bent to whisper into the boy's ear. "If you can play the part as well as you look it," she advised, "you'll have no problems." She bustled out into the courtyard and placed a hand to her forehead. "Ah, husband, I'm not feeling at all well." Abner's brow furrowed, and he opened his mouth to speak. Before he could utter a word, Leah caught Nathaniel's hand and brought him out from behind her. "How lucky that Ezra's daughter Naomi is staying with us while he does business in the city. She's a good child, and has offered to get the water for me." Abner stood and stared as Nathaniel tilted his head and fluttered his lashes. The boy could just imagine what he must look like. Leah had smoothed his dark hair back from his forehead and secured it with a blue band. To the band she'd added a long veil, a fold of which could be tucked in to cover the lower half of his face. She had applied some kohl, insisting that it made his eyes appear larger and brighter. He wore an ankle-length gown of blue linen, belted in at his slender waist with a multicolored sash. He spun in a slow circle for Abner's inspection. After one full turn, he held out a hand to admire several bracelets that dangled on his wrist, and he pointed a toe to display the dainty sandals on his feet. Nathaniel laughed at the expression on the baker's face. "Please, you must allow me to do this small thing. You've both been so kind to me. I'm sure that my father would approve." He added a lilt to his voice, and the transformation was as complete as he could make it. He wondered what Elijah would say if he could see his servant now. The thought sobered him. He had an uneasy suspicion that the prophet would not approve. Abner shook his head as though rousing himself from a dream. Leah clapped her hands and rocked up on her toes, laughing. "What do you think now, husband?" she cried. "I think you're devious," he retorted. "Surely you wouldn't send a young girl new to the city to fetch the water alone. How could she be expected to find her way?" Leah did not hesitate. Her smile was smug as she outlined her plan. "I'll ask Rachel to walk with her. She usually goes at this time of day, and they are the same age. They'll be good company for each other. Come along, Naomi." Leah put an arm around his shoulders. "Perhaps you should take the skins instead of the water jar," she suggested. Nathaniel realized that neither of them had noticed the change in his mood. They'd never understand if he changed his mind now. He did his best to ignore his misgivings and nodded in agreement. Leah was right about the water jar. He knew he'd never be able to manage it without giving himself away. It took years of practice for the women to be able to carry the full jars on their heads without spilling a drop. No girl his age would be as clumsy as he was sure to be. Abner handed him the 2 water skins, and he hurried after the baker's wife. She was already in the doorway to the street, scanning the small groups of women and girls passing by on their way to the cistern. She must have spotted the girl she was looking for, because she began fluttering her hand in the air above her head. "Rachel! Rachel!" she called in a piercing voice. Nathaniel winced. One of the girls looked over at Leah's frantic beckoning and broke away from the group she had been walking with. As he watched her approach, Nathaniel felt a queer fluttering in his stomach. She moved with an easy grace that would be hard to match. She wore a veil like all respectable girls of good family, and she had the bluest eyes he'd ever seen. Unusual in his people. "Rachel, my dear, I'm so glad I caught you." Leah wrapped a motherly arm around the girl and turned to present her to Nathaniel. "I want you to meet Naomi. She is the daughter of a dear friend of ours. He's in the city on business, and she is spending the day with us." Rachel's eyes crinkled as she smiled behind her veil at him, and Nathaniel felt his face flush with sudden heat. Leah patted his shoulder and went on without pausing for breath. "I find I can't go for the water today. There's so much to do that it makes my head spin. Anyway, Naomi has offered to get it for me. She is a great help and a comfort at a time like this, not like a guest at all. But she's new to the city, you see." "She can come with me," Rachel interrupted, her blue eyes dancing. "Well, yes, that was just what I wanted to suggest," said the baker's wife with a broad smile. "Just go along with Rachel, child, and you can make an outing of it. Perhaps your father will have returned by the time you get back." She gave Nathaniel a hug that threatened to smother him and waved them on their way with one last flutter of her plump fingers. Rachel balanced her empty jug on her hip and linked her free arm in his as they moved off. "How lucky you are, Naomi," she sighed. "I've never been outside the walls of this city. Does your father take you with him often?" Nathaniel had played many roles in his young life. He'd never found it difficult to act a part before, but now he felt uncomfortable with the lie. It surprised him. He could almost hear Elijah's judgment on all deceivers. Rachel was waiting for an answer, and he tried not to think of the prophet. "Oh, he likes to keep me with him. There are only the 2 of us." "Oh, your mother is dead, then?" Nathaniel nodded, and she squeezed his arm in a gesture of sympathy. "Well," she said brightly, "let me guess. Your father must be a shepherd or something." "Why do you say that?" he demanded. "Well, it's obvious you spend most of your time out in the open," she pointed out. "Look how brown you are." He looked from her delicate complexion to his own sun-browned arms and tried to pull the sleeve of his gown lower. "Oh, don't," she cried. "I didn't mean to embarrass you. I don't think it's unattractive at all. You're really quite pretty in your own way." He could feel his face get hot again, and he tried without success to think of some way to change the subject. "I suppose it must be dangerous on the roads," she went on after a pause. "If you and your father travel a lot, perhaps you should cut your hair and dress like a boy. That way no one would think to carry you off." Nathaniel choked and then had a fit of coughing. He looked across at his companion, but her blue eyes were sincere. If she suspected the truth, she was a better actor than he was. "What an idea," he managed to respond. "I don't think my father would ever agree, though." When they joined the rest of the women and girls, he kept his eyes lowered and did his best to appear shy and awkward. Rachel kept her arm linked in his and took it on herself to answer their questions. There was a bad moment when Nathaniel was confronted by an old woman he recognized. She sold baskets in the marketplace. She stared at him for a long moment, frowning in concentration. "I know you," she insisted. "I'm sure I've seen you before. Who did you say your father was?" Rachel interrupted with a laugh. "Oh, you're mistaken this time, Hester. This is Naomi's first visit to Samaria." "Don't be impudent, child. I never forget a face," the old woman insisted. But she's right, Nathaniel assured her. I suppose I could be mistaken, she muttered, but she looked far from convinced. She was still muttering as she moved off up the road. Nathaniel looked at Rachel and shrugged. He was glad Leah had made them go together. It helped to have her speak for him. At last they reached the line of women at the cistern. He stole a glance at the girl beside him. He liked her. What would she think if she knew his name was Nathaniel and not Naomi? He was half tempted to confess the whole masquerade to her. He put it out of his mind as their turn came at last. He peered into the mouth of the well that gave access to the water supply. The cistern was hollowed out of the rock under the paving stones they stood on. The darkness was almost complete in the well, and he could see nothing of the cavern below. The water had to be there, of course. It flowed in from underground springs, or so the story went. He'd always preferred to get his own water outside the city. It wasn't unheard of for men or boys to carry water from these cisterns, but Abner was right. It was a sure way of getting noticed. He wished he hadn't made such a foolish offer to Leah. Even with his disguise, he felt exposed. He took a deep breath. He might as well get on with it. Nathaniel took hold of the long rope attached to a leather bucket that was used for lifting the water to the surface. He let it down into the cistern and played out the rope until he heard a hollow splash in the depths of the cavern. He felt the extra weight as he began to haul in the rope hand over hand. The bracelets were a nuisance. They kept sliding up and down his arms. No one speaks of it, Rachel murmured, but the water level has dropped. It seems we must lift the bucket higher every day. They took turns until they had filled the trough beside the well. Then they dipped Rachel's jar and the 2 water skins in the trough to fill them. Rachel lifted the jar in one lithe movement and balanced it on her head. She kept one hand on it to steady it and was ready to go. Oh, you're going to get wet, Rachel laughed. Nathaniel slung one water skin over each shoulder. He could feel the cool wetness of them soaking into the gown at his back. I don't mind, he reassured her. The sun is already hot and it feels good. They did not hurry on the way back. Rachel had begun to talk of the home she would like to have one day. It didn't matter what she talked about. Nathaniel just liked the sound of her voice. They were brought up short by a raucous shout of laughter. "Ho there, little girls," called a tall youth of about 15. "Where's your mother this morning?" He elbowed his 2 companions and swaggered forward to block the way. Rachel darted a look around, but the other women were no longer in sight. Nathaniel cursed himself for a fool. How had he let them get separated from the rest? He should have been paying attention. The 3 boys moved closer, grinning. Nathaniel had met their kind before. His muscles tensed. "Let's have a look at your face, Blue Eyes," snarled the leader. He reached out to snatch at Rachel's veil, and she shrank back, dropping her water jar. It fell to the ground and shattered, its precious contents pouring away into the gutter. "No!" she wailed, stooping to the broken pieces. He laughed and reached for her again. Nathaniel let one of his heavy water skins slide to the ground and used both hands to swing the other. It caught the boy squarely on the side of the head with a resounding smack, and he staggered back against the wall. They were going to be angry now. There was no telling what they would do. Well, they'd get more than they'd bargained for this time. Nathaniel wasn't about to let them do as they pleased. He snatched up a handful of stones. "Yell!" he shouted at Rachel as the 3 boys began closing in on them, their faces twisted in rage. The long gown hampered his movements, but even so his missiles were striking with considerable force. Instead of yelling, Rachel scrambled for stones of her own and began throwing with a vengeance. Her aim was wild, but she made up for it in enthusiasm. The 3 bullies had retreated amidst howls of pain by the time another group of women rounded the corner. Nathaniel caught at Rachel's arm. "Come on, we'd better walk with them. You can take one of the water skins. I'm sure Leah won't mind." Rachel didn't answer. She was staring at him, 2 bright spots of color staining her pale cheeks. He waited, wondering if he had somehow given himself away. Finally, she shook her head and took up the water skin he was holding out to her. They left the ruined jar where it lay and hurried after the others. They didn't say much till they reached the street of the bakers. Nathaniel tried to imagine what she was thinking, but only succeeded in giving himself a headache. Not far from Abner's door, she stopped and turned to him. "I've never met anyone like you before," she said. "You're not like other girls." Nathaniel squirmed and cleared his throat. It was on the tip of his tongue to tell her the truth, but he swallowed the impulse. He couldn't risk it. He was startled when she reached over and hugged him, pressing her soft cheek against his. "I hope your father brings you back to Samaria again soon," she whispered. "Goodbye, Naomi." Nathaniel heaved a sigh of relief as he watched her walk away. He would be back all right. They had to eat, didn't they? But he was through with pretending. "I am not going to do that again," he said with conviction. "From now on, I'll just have to be me." He would wait until dusk and slip out of the city with his supplies. Elijah was waiting. And that is where we're going to leave off for today. I hope you'll join me next time to find out what happens next. Be sure to hit the subscribe button if you enjoyed today's episode. Till next time, keep dreaming and God bless.